Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of the Classics Show. I am your host, Shabnam Riaz. Okay, so for today's program, we are going to talk about a very, very famous Urdu novel that was published in 1963. And the name of that novel is Udas Nasle, and this is the English translation, The Weary Generations. And it was an instant bestseller at that time, and now it's beyond its 40th edition. So to talk about today's book and the author, of course, we're going to speak to our guest, who is Mr. Raza Naeem, and you are president of the Progressive Writers Association in Lahore, translator and academic. Welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, and as we're talking about, Udas Nasle, and of course it was written by Abdullah Hussain. So, this is the translation. We're going to talk about this as well, as we will talk about the original work in Urdu.
Sure.
So tell us, Raza, after 50 years, more than 50 years of its publication, it's still, valued by critics, by readers. It's revisited, it's reread, the translations as well. What made it such a great success?
Well, if the writer was alive, he would say that it's the only book of his which critics have ever read, But for some writer, for a book to cross the 50 landmark in a country where books don't have a very long life is a very big landmark.
After more than 50 years,
Yes.
Why is it still relevant today?
Well, I think partly because some of the issues which the novel deals with have not died. There is still a lot of oppression and injustice in Pakistani society, in fact South Asian society. And of course the novel, if you look at it closely, was written in a very syncretic, it celebrates syncretism of a time which is now becoming a distant memory, a time which we normally don't like to talk about in our textbooks, which is a time when communal hatred was at its minimum. So, books only become relevant. There are two ways. Either readers keep it alive, which in this case is absolutely true, and secondly, they remain alive because if the issues they deal with remain and they have not been solved, and I say this with the caveat that books and writers rarely bring about revolutions. We may get sentimental, but that's never the case. But yes, as long as the issues remain alive, the book will remain alive. So, that is the reason why, and of course the title is of course very poignant. And Abdullah Sahab, when he was alive, used to say that every generation of ours, every succeeding generation is becoming wearier by them. Udas se udas tareen hamari naslein hoti ja rahi hain, and also, so yeah, the book.
So what's the definition of udas here?
Well, many people had a problem that how come the Urdu novel is called Udas Nasle, and Abdullah Sahab translated it almost very romantically as the weary generations. But it turns out that he was not wrong. He had a very good idea why he wanted to name it as the weary generations. He searched for 1 year for an appropriate title, and he settled.
1 year.
Yes, and he settled on the weary generations because the answer is partly in the book. If you read the book, because I teach history, in our textbooks we teach that the achievement of Pakistan was made with a lot of sacrifices. Nonsense, says Abdullah Hussain. The leaders did not give any sacrifice. It was the ordinary people who travelled on foot, and the massacres happened.
Mass migration of people.
Yes, and that difference, this class divide, comes out very forcefully in this novel.
Okay, so that's the title of the novel, and that's very, very interesting. Especially the fact that 1 year was taken to find the right sort of description that would give some sort of essence to the reader as to what they're about to embark upon. Okay, so I think this is really interesting that, Abdullah Hussain translated this himself. How did that come about?
Well, when the original novel came out in 1963, and there's a whole story attached to that as well. The story is that Abdullah Hussain trained as a cement engineer. He went to Canada and came back with a diploma, and he was posted to a remote area of then NWFP called Daud Khel, where he was working in a cement factory. So according to Abdullah Hussain, for 7 hours he used to work, for 7 hours he used to sleep, and for 7 hours he used to stare at walls. So he was really bored and he had nothing to do. So he decided to begin a love story.
Okay.
And like, you know, in Pakistan, even to love is a form of politics. So the love story gradually expanded to become a political novel, then it became a historical novel, and before he knew it, it was a 700 page book. And when
And how long did that take him?
it took him about, you know, a couple of years, you know, and the conditions must have been very bad at Daud Khail, you know. If you even in those days there was no Facebook or Twitter, so obviously, and electricity did not used to go very regularly, so he had absolutely great freedom to write what he wanted.
So much,
So when he came with this big fat book to the publisher, he said, the publisher said, we don't know you, you know, why should we, why can't I take, how can I take a risk on this novel? So why don't you write a few short stories first, let the readers get to know you, and then maybe we can think about publishing this novel. And as the event turns out, he did publish a few short stories which were part of his collection called Nashaib, which was his first book. And
were these short stories published in a periodical, or were they?
No, they now exist in the, you know, there are 2 volumes of short stories now. But then
at that time,
yeah, his real name was Muhammad Khan. So he basically said that Colonel Muhammad Khan is already a very established novel humorist. So he took the name basically of one of his colleagues, Abdullah Hussain. You know, that was his pen name, and that became his identity. So by the time the novel came out, the novel, you know, it was a sensation because it was not written in the traditional style of the Urdu walas. Abdullah Hussain was not lettered in Urdu like Manto, like him, you know. Manto failed metric exam 3 times, and they used to say about him that ise Urdu nahi aati. Same with Abdullah Hussain, you know, because his mother died very early. So you know, the language of the novel is very unusual. Many people said कि आप उर्दू में पंजाबी लिखने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं.
Is it more colloquial?
It is very colloquial.
And that also is another reason for a huge success, is it not, for a book to be able to, you know, for a reader to understand that this is coming unadulterated, purely from the heart.
Exactly. You know, and some of the great novels have been written like that. Some, exactly. You know, for example, Abdullah Hussain said that where I did not know the word, I invented it. You know, if you read The Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, that's also a very experimental novel. You know, he has borrowed the language from Russian and God knows from where. That is the same with James Joyce's Ulysses. You know, people don't want to read it. It's a very inventive novel. And I think the language is partly the reason why these great books, including the very generation, survive, you know. And also, you know, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, you know. So I class the very Udas Nasle with all these novels, and I think partly the key to decoding that mystery as why the novel has been continuously in print is because the language is totally untraditional. And, you know, and obviously people, the Mandarins did not like it, the religious people did not like it, and the story is that it was about to be banned, but it won the biggest literary prize in Pakistan. And then it was difficult to suppress it, you know, and Abdullah Hussain became established author overnight, and, you know, he obviously gave up his cement profession and he became a full-time writer. So yeah, this is how the novel actually came along, out of boredom, you know.
Imagine. And then exactly as you pointed out, for a first-time writer to come out with such a huge novel and then to be able to, you know, take it to the publishers, and then the very same, you know, point that was taken up, that how can we publish you? We don't know you. So that time of recognition where a first-time writer is going out and putting their, basically, you know, that they've bled onto paper, and putting that in front of someone is completely nerve-wracking, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, obviously it changed the whole fortunes of Abdullah Hussain. It gave us one of the biggest writers of the 20th century, you know, and God knows what would have happened had that publisher not taken a bet on this novel. And of course, Abdullah Hussain went on to write many more books, and all of his books are on very unpopular topics, you know, and, you know, so yes, I mean, वो कहते हैं ना कि खून को थूक कर लिखना, तो वो that process was there with Abdullah Saab's work also, and also I think a stroke of luck, because Abdullah Hussain had a nervous breakdown after the early death of his mother passed away very early, his father passed away, so he had a nervous breakdown and he was convalescing, and with him was this fellow who had served in the First World War, and while they were convalescing, they struck up a friendship. And he told Abdullah Hussain that I served in the First World War and I have a diary of a soldier who fought in the First World War, and I would be willing to part with it for whoever would care. So Abdullah Hussain actually, when he had recovered, he actually followed that old soldier to his village. According to him, that's how he likes it, 4 miles on foot, 4 miles on train, 4 miles on Gada Gadi, and he went to his house and stayed with him and got access to that diary. And this is where the political and historical part of the novel is. So this is how it became a sprawling epic from a maudlin love story of
this
two.
is the transition.
So so it is a unique mixture of archival research and heartfelt feeling and and of course he wrote it while he was abroad. Not in Pakistan. So it's a unique mixture of documentary evidence, and I mean, he's not one of those writers who's just written based totally on fictional characters. He actually had access to a witness of the First World War who had won the Victoria Cross. So how many of us actually have that opportunity? I wouldn't say. So he was in a very unique position to write this novel.
Right.
Only probably he could have written Udas Naslein.
Right.
And it has been compared to Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude in its epic sweep.
So the impact of the historical romance, how much of that is something that, it's a hugely appealing audience for readers, is it not?
Actually, if you talk about Udas Naslein, I have argued in my introduction, it is more than just a book on history. It is more than just a book on romance. I think I have argued it's a big book on 3 different levels. I mean, for example, you can take it as a straight historical novel, recounting very faithfully some of the events which were a part of our joint history. When I say joint, I mean Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. Now the last 2 people we don't want to talk about anymore, even though we have a white part in our flag. But it talks about those incidents, and we don't remember those incidents now in our history. And if you are not willing to take it as a historical novel, you can read it as a plain old-fashioned love story between 2 people who are hopelessly unmatched.
But then there are so many layers within this book,
Yes.
are they not? The social fabric, class system,
yes,
and also basic intrinsic human emotions.
Yes, and of course I was going to say that it's also about the Punjab, and it's interesting because many people, I mean, Abdullah Hussain was a proud Punjabi all his life. It was his wish to write a pure Punjabi novel, and many critics actually accused Abdullah Hussain of betraying his Punjabi roots and not writing a novel in Punjabi. But this is a love letter to the Punjab. I mean, if you read the book, it has got loving and copious descriptions of some of the rural culture of Punjab. I'm not sure if some of that exists anymore. I mean, you have these boar hunting, this whole 5-page description of boar hunting, which is amazing. You have this whole description of harvests. You have this description of the bullock races, how the peasants used to compete with each other. And you have an example of the flirtations which go on. And across the communal divide, you have this Sikh gentleman called Mahinder Singh who is bantering with a Muslim girl. And there is no, I mean, communalism was not the problem. It was not discussed whether you are a Muslim, I'm a Sikh. Plain banter. And I'm not sure if some of that is, and yes, I also have to tell you about this custom of, how a Punjabi man is welcomed into manhood. If you go at night to your rival's place and you steal a bullock and come back with him to your home alive, they put this pagadi on you and say, well, welcome to manhood. And obviously it's fraught with danger. But there are also, it's not all fun and frolic, because this is also a class divide. I mean, retribution is also very swift. For example, when the police finds out that the bullock has been stolen, every day and next day they come to the village, hang the offender upside down and lash him. Then there is another scene where there is a hunting party. There's a dispute over the use of water. If my field is crisscrossing your field, I can't divert the water supply to my. So one of Mahinder's cousins is killed over this fight. So overnight a murder party is arranged. The women, they go Indian file overnight to their rivals. They are sleeping. They, they pull over the chadars and hack them to death, and then they scatter the pieces as if nothing has happened, and then return to their village at night. So these kinds of things continue to happen, Zaat, Paat, Baradri. So they are also part of this rural culture, and so it is also about Punjab, as it is about history and as it is about romance.
Okay, so you told us about how the novel came into existence. Okay, so this is 1963. It's published. Then the translation. How did that come around?
Well, it took 30 years for the translation to come about. I am myself a translator, so I can really appreciate that Abdullah Hussain was a very patient man. I mean, he was writing other novels, and I'm sure at the back of his mind was, why is this novel not being translated? So
why was it not being translated?
Partly the decision to translate came from his desire to reach a Western audience, because he's such a great writer. By the way, it didn't come out, but he is one of those that limited club of writers who were bilingual. He's written novels in English and Urdu. So the novel was not translated. Partly because Abdullah Hussain did not spend any time in Pakistan. You need a lobby. You need a lobby to support you in anything, literary awards, translation. He was totally away from, not invested in all that. He was running an off-license store in London. He spent a lot of time abroad, so he had no lobby there. He was writing all these novels while he was abroad, which were uniquely rooted in Pakistan. So after 30 years, he used to say that Pakistanis are a lazy lot, they don't like to read, and much more than that, when they like something, they don't want to translate it. So why don't I translate my own novel? And UNESCO approached Abdullah Hussain then, and they said, we regard Udas Naslein as one of the representative works of Urdu, which is a great honor. So Abdullah Hussain said, why would you ask someone else to translate? Let me try to translate it. And by the way, it is not only a translation, it's a transliteration. It's a totally different novel. Many people don't know about it, but he has taken a lot of liberties with the English version. Some of the plot is totally changed. Some of the characters have been changed, and of course the ending is very different, and some of the incidents are totally different. I think the English novel actually ends on a more upbeat note, but not the Urdu
then that comes
version.
to my next question.
Sure.
Which is the better one of the two? I mean, of course, that's a subjective question because every reader will take their own. But what is the general feel out there?
Well, who am I to say? I'm just a lowly translator. I mean, I'm not a literary critic, and this is why Abdullah Hussain was always wary of critics, because critics are very good at making lists. Which is better, which is our favorite book, and they love to pit one novel against the other. For example, Abdullah Hussain always used to say that the critics have not gone beyond Udas Naslein. Some of them even think I've only written one novel. They love to compare. I think the English novel has to be taken on its own merit.
Okay, now another question. So when, of course, he's doing this translation, he's now targeting or writing for a Western audience.
Yes.
How much of that impacted the story, the storylines, and the writing technique?
The novel also has another use. I mean, our current young generation, they don't speak Urdu. Some of them can't read the Roman script even, For example, in universities like LUMS, they have to hire instructors for them now to teach them Urdu. How will you market this novel, which is one of the greatest novels written in the Urdu language, to them in the 21st century? So I would say you will look at the English edition, because unfortunately, they don't have the language skills to appreciate a novel which is so inventive in its language in Urdu. So this is also another use. So I don't think I would be really worried about what sort of liberties Abdullah Hussain has taken, in the English version of the novel.
Right. So when we're talking about the writer here, if we talk about his amazing gift, writing techniques, what were his strengths?
Look, Udas Naslein is a sprawling saga of generations, and this is why actually I was in Winnipeg, Canada in September at a literary festival promoting this book, and there one reader came up to me and said something really interesting. He said, okay, we understand. I mean, I didn't know about Abdullah Hussain. I didn't know about this fantastic novel on the partition. But have you actually read William Faulkner? And I said, no. he said, I will advise you to read his books, because he talks about Yakna Pataupa County. He also talks about a divide. And I said, that's pretty interesting. He says, and I asked him, I said, what divide is he talking about? Because I knew America had never been partitioned. It had won its independence. He said he talks about the Mason-Dixon line, this whole divide between the North and the South, where the slavery. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. I mean, I have never read William Faulkner, and I didn't even know that it was possible for someone who didn't know about the partition of India to think about that, about an American writer, to make connections. So, one of the things about the novel is you make a connection, I mean, you immediately make a connection with, for example, Balzac, who is a French writer. It reminds you of some similar epics which were written in earlier times. For example, John Galsworthy, the Forsyte Saga, or as I mentioned before, Garcia Marquez, who comes from a totally different tradition of magical realism.
But then magical realism, it has been said that some of this book the author has sort of had some...
No magical realism. There's a magical realism in The Midnight Children. And in fact, when the novel came out in the West, some of the critics compared it with Paul Scott, who has written a whole series of novels on the Raj, called the Raj Quartet, and they compared it, because critics love to compare. With Abdullah Hussain, in this novel, he has used a fisherman to tell the tale in 6 pages of what actually happened in Jallianwala Bagh. It was a colonial massacre. Innocent people were killed. They were celebrating Baisakhi, which is the arrival of spring. And when reading that description, you are just harrowed. It looks like the bullets are actually not being fired on those fictional characters. They're actually being fired on you. So this is not magical realism. It is realism at its best. Similarly, Paul Scott, he is talking about the emotions of the British, what they felt about ending their rule in India. He is talking about Anglo-Indians, what they are feeling about the British, but he is not even talking about realism. So in this novel, one of the strengths is the realistic mode. Yesterday night, someone was telling me that I don't want to buy this novel because it's very pessimistic. Well, but life is pessimistic, it's a black humor, it's a black comedy, and obviously that's a very established genre in the West. So, I mean, how will you write about pessimistic things? The only way to write about them is pessimistically and realistically.
Okay, then some people come up with the argument that, for escapism and for literature, for art, whatever form you're taking it, that the reader who wants to, just immerse themselves into the world of escapism, then what's happening for them?
Well, they should probably read Shobha Day, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, she's just turned 70 and she's celebrating it in a grand style by coming up with another pop schlock book of hers. I mean, obviously that variety is there in Urdu literature. Also, you have a rich variety of pulp fiction, cheap pulp fiction. You have these Urdu digests. And even some of the writers who are writing on Hum Television have become novelists only so that they can write for television, not for their service to literature. In the morning, I was having this conversation about one such writer, Umair Ahmed. I was asked, do you like her? I said, no, because she's exclusively writing for television. She is not doing any service to literature. So there's a whole crop of those. So if people want to read escapist fiction, they can read Harry Potter, for all that matters. It's a brilliant example of escapism. Even Tolkien is different from J.K. Rowling, the Lord of the Rings, it's a very serious novel,
Yes.
So there's that. Then probably they should be writing, reading people like Abdullah Hussain, and of course I respect their right to do it.
So let's talk about the English version, and you've written the introduction to
I've been privileged to do this, yes.
To this translation.
Yes,
Tell us about that. What have you discussed in your introduction?
Well, I think before that I should tell you that I actually got into this very accidentally. I am translating one of Abdullah Hussain's other novels, which is my favorite Abdullah Hussain novel, which is Qad. And if we have time, we can talk about it later on. But my literary agent, who is India's biggest literary agent, but he doesn't say so himself, nor he feels like one. He actually emailed me last year. He said that the Very Generations is being reissued by HarperCollins. Would you want to do an introduction? And I said, why not? It is such a privilege to be able to write an introduction to such an important book. And I did not read the Urdu version to write this introduction because I thought I will be biased, because people love to compare the Urdu and the English version.
Okay.
Because it's a wholly different novel. You can't compare a novel written 50 years ago with a novel which is a totally different novel written in different circumstances. So if I had read the Urdu version, I would not have done justice to the. So I deliberately kept myself away from reading the Urdu version. I had this old version. This is a much beautiful cover. I had this earlier version which was eaten by termites, and it looks like a collector's edition now. So what helped was I was going to the United States. It's a long flight. So I took the novel, I read the novel, and it helped me to write an introduction, because I'm not a critic, I'm sorry. I haven't even tried to compare in my introduction with the Urdu version, because it's a totally unnecessary comparison, which is because that's what critics do. My job was, how do I approach this novel as a translator?
Yeah.
So, so what I have written in the introduction is that the novel needs to be three things. Number one, the novel in English needs to be taken as an English novel. It does not have to deal with the baggage of the Urdu novel, which was written in a different time.
It should be taken as a separate entity.
Exactly. Okay. And of course, in that respect, I think it is probably the second most significant novel written after 1947. You have Zulfikar Ghose's The Murder of Aziz Khan, which is also about feudalism, which was written in 1963. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And of course, literary festivals have totally ignored it, because it was also written at a time when Pakistan was, ensconced in autocracy, Ayub Khan dictatorship. And this is the other novel written in 1998. So it needs to be taken as an original English novel, and it's an unpopular argument. Secondly, what I have mentioned is that this novel it needs to be taken as much more than a partition novel. We've already talked about that. It can be read as a historical romance.
You mentioned three themes.
It can be taken as a Punjabi, and this is an original argument, because unfortunately not many people have even read this novel, the English one in Pakistan. They keep comparing it. So I think this novel is a different novel, and it needs to be taken on its own. So it's much more than a partition novel.
This has a much different flavor.
It has a different, yes. And of course, the characters are much pared down. The original novel is a 700-page behemoth. This is, I think, on much. I mean, it's hardly less than 300 pages. It's very digestible in that. It's very edible in that sense. And also, the character. And what I've also argued is that some of the main woman character is not a very strong character. I don't like her, but the minor characters are really very interesting,
Okay,
so,
the supporting ones. Okay, we'll get back to this conversation.
Sure.
Don't change the channel. Okay, welcome back to the programme. Before we went to the break, we were talking about your introduction to the translation of Udas Naslin, The Weary Generation. What was the message that you wanted to give in that introduction?
Well, I wanted to give the message that, there's a good reason why this novel has been reissued after more than 30 years since it was first published in 1998, and the reason is that the title of the novel reflects that it has become a metaphor for 21st century Pakistan. It was written as a metaphor for 20th century Pakistan, but unfortunately it has become a very powerful metaphor for 21st century Pakistan. And the message is that the class divide, which we've talked about earlier, still exists in Pakistan, and this can only be redressed. I mean, a real revolution can only come not by writing novels. Writers have a very limited role in that aspect, but it can only come if we take our rights and we demand our rights from our ruling elite, those people
But then,
who rule us in our name.
True. But then, when it comes to a time of revolution, we see that the artists and the writers are amongst one of the first people who are rounded up and put away. So that actually shows the power that they can have.
Yes, and throughout the period of dictatorship, some of our best artists have always been imprisoned, whether it's people like Shima Kirmani or Ahmed Nadeem Qasmi. Manto was prosecuted 3 times in colonial India, 3 times in independent Pakistan. He drank himself to death eventually, or whether it's Habib Jalib or it's Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Some of the, in fact, it's said that Faiz's best poetry was when he was in prison. जो ज़िंदानी शायरी जिसको हम कहते हैं. But
and not just for our part of the world, or global. This is a global phenomenon.
Yes, I mean, you look at Iran, the films which are coming out of Iran. It doesn't mean that we have to replicate those conditions, God forbid. But and Abdullah Hussain was very lucky in that respect, because he wrote about unpopular things all his life, but he was never in Pakistan. He escaped that incarceration and punishment, and only he could do that. He was very lucky in that respect, and a writer can only dream for that sort of unacceptability. I mean, he's written about some very difficult topics. For example, what happened in Kashmir when Pakistan had its first war in India in 1965, Operation Gibraltar. What is the truth about that? Because it's cloaked in mythology, frankly speaking. Then in his novel Nadar Log, which I have talked about, he wrote about what happened in 1971. He was the first writer to access the Hamudur Rahman Commission report, which has been there all along, but some portions of it have been published in India, but in Pakistan it is a no-go area. So he was the first writer who actually accessed it, and he actually gave out the truth of what our complicity was in the creation of Bangladesh, the failures of our ruling elite. And no other writer of that generation has actually done that. It's very fashionable now to write about it in English fiction, but in Urdu fiction, these novels, and then in Qad, the novel I'm translating, it's an honor killing in reverse, which would make a what Abdullah Saab's daughter says, it would make a fascinating Bollywood film, because it actually talks about a woman taking revenge on men. Usually it's the other way around, honor killing, What happens when a woman seeks to avenge what was done to her child in the name of conformity, in the name of this blind worship of superstition and tradition. And that novel was written based on a very real incident. So all of his novels, I am also trying to, and I hope my introduction sends the reader back to the original Urdu version, which was not a stated aim in the introduction, but it is my desire, because translators are not the writers. They are seen as mostly as useless intermediaries, needlessly trying to intersperse themselves between the writer and the audience. But my, I take a different view. My, reason for writing this introduction was that the English novel needs to be celebrated on its own account, and the reader should go back to the original Urdu, the fact that as long as injustice remains in Pakistan, novels like Udas Nasle and will be written, and they will be published, and they will be read.
Now, you're talking about translations and translators in general. I would think that a translator has a huge responsibility, and also in taking that, that work forward into other dimensions and other spheres where a writer would have thought, I'm contained at the moment. You're writing in a specific language wherever you are. So I would think that a translator is a really, really important part of the literary scene.
Not in this part of the world. I'm sorry to say, in the West, it is the state which sponsors translators, its private agencies. For example, the British Council sponsors a lot of translation prizes. There are magazines. I've submitted translations in translation contests which are organized by magazines. It's for us. It's also a way to introduce a writer who English-speaking readers will never know if it's not for translation. Exactly. But in this part of the world, this is a relatively new and foreign thing. And then there's a difference between literary translators and commercial translators. For
Right.
example, I'll just share my experience with you. When I go and talk to people, they often ask me, what do you do? And I say my day job is not as more interesting than my evening job. I'm a translator. And then they say, okay, how much do you charge per page? And then I give them a good look, and I look at them for a full minute. I said, I am not a commercial translator, I am a literary translator, which means that,
There's a huge difference.
yeah, I mean, because
you are immersing into the subject.
yes,
taking
and
it as a
you
passion.
are being very selective about what you want to translate. It's not that you are being paid money and you say, I'm going to translate fiction, non-fiction, textbooks on maths, textbooks on chemistry. We don't have that
completely
luxury.
different
So,
thing.
I came to Abdullah Hussain because I was really interested. He died in 2015, and I was really, I was amazed to find out that none of his work, except which is not
Which
even
he did himself.
been translated. So I said, let me look for a compact work which speaks for itself and it's also representative. So I settled on CAD. So literary translators. I mean, you sign contracts. You actually have a literary agent. You don't do that with commercial translations. They just pick and choose, and the only incentive is money, 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 money. Money, and money is also a theme in this novel. Also, how people love making money above everything else, So yeah, translators, and in this time of globalization, translation is a very important enterprise. There are political parties and politicians who remind us about how different we are from each other, but translators actually try to do the opposite. They actually say that the global human values which are all common to us can be found in world literature. You can find the same thirst to live and to create in varied generations, which you can find in Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude, or in, so this is how translators help to bridge this so-called globalized divide,
Right.
And actually,
Which is very helpful for people who want to exploit it in certain ways.
exactly, so in that respect, literature translation is a great antidote, to all these demagogic politicians who keep telling us that, we are different,
We
our
need
skin
walls.
color is different, but no,
You're breaking down those walls.
we are actually, we all have the same desires, we have the same wishes. No one wants to live in a world of injustice.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to live in a world where their rights are guaranteed, where there is social, economic justice. And this is a vision which goes back to the founders of Pakistan. I mean, whether it's Iqbal or it's Jinnah or it's Syed Ahmed Khan, all of them,
Of course.
they wanted to create a society which was not based on communalism, and how we have done exactly the opposite. So it is works like this which actually put us in touch with who we really are.
Exactly.
And not what some politician tells us in a crazed moment, and
Very
asks
true.
us to kill or murder or something like that.
Tell us about your experience with dramatic reading. It's very interesting, it's for the
Well,
viewers.
I was hoping to read a few excerpts and you'll get a first-hand view of what I actually do
Definitely.
as a.
Please.
So yeah, there are two very short passages which I want to read. One is about, because the novel talks about the effects of war. It talks about the effects of war and what war does to people and what are the redeeming features of war.
Because war it has been glorified throughout history, and
Yes.
be it film or television or whatever,
And you had the centenary of the First World War, and everyone was putting their poppy flowers in England, and that was blood and gore, as if that's the only thing which war is about. So this is a short passage about the war, and then there is a passage about you were asking me what was the central theme of the novel. So this is a dialogue between the main hero or anti-hero, Naeem, and Mahinder, who is his childhood friend, and both have been recruited for World War I. And they come back and they are talking about the war. That was different, he said after a few long minutes. To avenge the blood of one of your own, even a rat can kill. Here we don't even know the people. It is like killing a pig or a jackal in the jungle. Well, Naeem said, that is what war is. Although supporting his weight on hands placed on either side of him on the stone, Mahinder Singh looked slumped, his back in the shape of a bow, his shoulders fallen, as if his body had taken on a different form. Tell me, Mahinder Singh asked suddenly, why are we here? Because of the war, Naeem said. The enemy has attacked. What? Attacked our village? Attacked the British Sarkar and their friends. What is it to us? They're our masters. Our master is Roshan Agha. Mahinder Singh said simply. Yes, and the English Sarkar is Roshan Agha's master. A brief hollow sound emerged from Mahinder Singh's mouth. How many masters do we have? Naeem laughed. Well, it's just the way it is. Mahinder Singh got up ponderously, as if making an effort to carry the weight of his clothes. I like this place, he said, gesturing towards the graves. Here, good people are buried, with names. And the second one is actually a very pithy paragraph which actually defines why the novel was written and why it continues to be relevant. This was a class that was rich, fairly rich and very rich, educated, calling itself liberal, indulging in anything between idle talk and lip service, with the chief objective of having a good time together, which gave it a sense of solidarity, besides the satisfaction of taking an active part in the historical development of their country. This was a class of people that was to remain, despite reform, largely intact and in command for many years, until the day of judgment was to arrive. As their destination came nearer, hopes of survival grew, and acquiring money finally took priority over everything else. And I would repeat this line, and acquiring money finally took priority over everything else. And that has not ended in the 21st century.
It sort of sounds like a death sentence, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it's a tremendous indictment. You know, our ruling elite is still busy making money, you know. I mean, so yeah, in that respect, it is a pessimistic conclusion, but it's also a very realistic conclusion, you know, and it gives us the weapons for forging our struggles, you know. So dramatic reading, I mean, my urge when I want to dramatize something, I mean, translators are very selective people, you know, not everything which you read is uplifting, but when occasionally you come across such a piece, then you want to dramatize it, and it is your elocution, it is those pauses and how you up and low your voice, that is the inflection which actually, you know, strikes a chord. Otherwise, a literature reading something can be very insipid enterprise, you know, and especially reading something pessimistic like the very generation. So I've had people tell me when I dramatize passages, and we haven't dramatized a lot from the novel on this program, and they tell me that, you know, it's pessimistic but it's also lyrical, and this is exactly the sort of feeling I want my audience to have. Right. You know, and that they should not only the words should not only sink in, but they should actually read the novel and decide for themselves. So yeah, I mean, you know, not every thing can be dramatized, and this is why, as a translator, I feel I'm a really very privileged person. Maybe others don't feel like that, but I feel I'm a privileged person because I have the ability to choose, you know, for effect and also for meaningfulness what I want to convey to my audience. And the writers I have mostly dramatized are people who belong to the progressive tradition, people like Krishan Chandra and Manto. I've read a lot of Manto, and young people are absolutely bowled over. You know, they said, is this guy, is he Pakistani? And I said, of course, he came to Pakistan, and look what we did with him. We made him drag himself to death after only 5 years after partition. And I choose people like Ismat Chughtai, who is a very powerful writer on women. You know, I mean, and satire, you know, sometimes satire speaks up where common sense fails, you know.
Definitely.
When you don't
has a
want
lasting
to,
impression.
when you don't want to listen to these speeches or talk shows, you know, you read satire, you know.
Which and again is a very intelligent technique.
Yes, and some of the best satire was created in the 50s and 60s. I don't think Muhammad Hanif can probably write, even he's a big star of the English literary establishment in Pakistan, but I think even he would agree that the satire which people like Abdullah Hussain or even Manto and Ismat have written, I don't think much is made of English writing in Pakistan. I don't think they can really approach that level, because that satire I mean, the conditions have to be there. The conditions are worse in Pakistan, but where is the satire? So we keep going back to these writers, and this is why I keep dramatizing them. I just did a TEDx talk at Superior University in Lahore on Ismat Chughtai's statement on feminism. It's called Aurat, you know, Adhi Aurat Adha Khab. And most of the young women, if you look at the video, they were absolutely bowled over. They said, is this a woman writing about another woman? But it's a feminist statement, you know.
Exactly.
It is about some of these aphorisms which males have constructed about the women. And Ismat Chughtai says, who are you to construct these aphorisms about females without our permission? And then in the second half, she comes to the more constructive part. She says, we have to construct a new aphorism for women of the 21st century. So these are, it is here that satire, yes, but redeeming also, redemption also, you know. Satire has its effects, but also redemption, you know. So this is why I choose to do dramatic writing. I'm not sure if I'm very successful at that, but you know, but one has to keep trying. I mean, I
No,
don't.
that was read very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And unfortunately, we're running out of time. So your message for the viewers today.
Well, my message is that read, and you know, read on and prosper. I mean, that's what I usually write when I'm asked to sign copies of the book. That's what I write as a autograph or an epitaph, if you're not an epitaph, hopefully. But I think it's very important to read.
Epitaph is again pessimistic.
And I'm a bit of an idealist, so I would say what Oscar Wilde once said. He's one of my favorite writers. He said that he was never an pessimist. He said
but he was
that,
a great satirist.
Yes, he said that you know, life is not worth living without utopia. I mean, he said something to that effect that, you know, if you want to live, you know, if you want to go forward, then you have to have some idealism. You know, you can't dream of a better world without utopia. You know, and you know, this is what you know, reading, it exposes us to that world. And obviously one doesn't have to be a revolutionary, but you know, it's very important to read and realize that.
Right. And any famous quotations by Abdullah Hussain that speak to you?
Well, yes, I was talking about it the other night. This was one. I mean, he died of cancer. He had a short but very painful struggle with cancer. He died on 4th July 2015, and he was very good. He was very active on Facebook. It was his way of connecting with the world. One of his last tweets was about Pakistan. His heart bled for Pakistan and what it had become. He said that in a country made in the name of religion, you make everybody a fanatic. You know, I mean, this is the irony when you make a country in the. So, I mean, that is what I would like to share, and obviously it was not meant as satire. It was meant to be realistic.
The importance of balance.
I think we see everything around us right now. I don't have to mention anything. We see this in the air. We see this in the ether. You know, how we have made everybody so intolerant and.
So we've come to the end of the programme, but Mr. Raza Naeem, it was really a pleasure speaking to you and sharing your dramatic reading as well and parts of the introduction, and a wonderful episode of today's programme. Thank you very much.
Pleasure is all mine, Shabnam Saiba.
Thank you very much. Okay, and with that we come to the end of today's programme. Hope you enjoyed watching it. Hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed talking about it. Until next week, bye-bye.